The supper had gone cold again. Arthur Barlow stood in the doorway of the ranch house kitchen, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his jaw tight as a bowstring drawn back and ready to snap. The plate of roasted venison and boiled potatoes sat exactly where he had left it 2 hours ago, dead center on the table, a single candle burning low beside it, the flame guttering in the draft from the open window. And Delia Holloway, the woman he had hired to keep his house and cook his meals, was nowhere to be found inside these four walls. This was the 9th night in a row. 9 nights of cold suppers. 9 nights of searching the dark house from room to room, calling her name into silence. 9 nights of finding her plate untouched, her chair pulled neatly back from the table, her food turned to stone in the October chill of the Texas Panhandle. Arthur crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, pressed 2 fingers against the side of the venison and felt nothing, not even the ghost of warmth. His stomach knotted, not with hunger but with something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to fear. He snatched up the lantern from the hook by the door, pushed out into the night, and stopped cold on the porch steps. She was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, not 30 feet away, her white cotton apron luminous in the moonlight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was not looking at the stars. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was simply sitting there, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face lifted slightly like a person who had learned to be invisible and had gotten very, very good at it. Arthur's first emotion was relief. His second was fury. "Miss Holloway," his voice came out harder than he intended. She flinched as if he had fired a pistol. "The supper is cold again." She did not answer immediately. She climbed down from the fence rail with that quiet, careful grace she always had, the kind that reminded him of a creature that had learned to move without making a sound, and she smoothed her apron with both hands before she looked at him. "I apologize, Mr. Barlow," she said. "I will reheat it. That is not the point." "I know," she said quietly. And she walked past him and through the kitchen door without another word, and he stood alone on the porch with the lantern and the darkness and 9 nights of cold suppers stacking up around him like a wall he could not yet name. He did not know yet. He could not have known. Not then. But he would learn. And what he learned would undo every assumption he had ever made about strength, about fear, and about the kind of courage it takes to survive something no one can see. To understand how Arthur Barlow and Delia Holloway arrived at this particular doorway, in this particular October, on the edge of the wild Texas Panhandle in the autumn of 1882, you have to go back 6 weeks to the September morning, when the stagecoach from Amarillo pulled up to the Barlow Ranch gate, and Delia stepped down onto the dry red earth for the first time. Arthur had not wanted a housekeeper. He had made this plain to his foreman, an old Comanche Wars veteran named Silas Prout, approximately 47 times over the past 2 months. He was a rancher. He ran 5,000 acres of cattle country with 12 men and a will as stubborn as the land itself. He did not need a woman in his house. He had managed perfectly well since his mother had passed 3 years ago. He had beans and biscuits and coffee, and that was sufficient for a man. Silas had said nothing to any of this. He had simply gone to Amarillo on the supply run and come back with Delia Holloway seated beside him on the wagon bench, her single carpet bag wedged between her feet and her hands folded in her lap exactly as Arthur would later come to recognize as her particular way of holding herself together. "She needed work," Silas said simply, climbing down from the wagon. "You needed a cook. Lord did the arithmetic." Arthur had looked at her then for the first time. She was 24 years old, with dark eyes that were steady and serious, a face that was neither plain nor beautiful, but that held a particular quality of watchfulness, like someone who had spent a long time studying exits. She was slim, not delicate. She wore a gray wool dress, practical and clean, and she looked back at him with a directness that caught him slightly off guard. "I cook well," she said. "I keep a clean house. I do not ask for much and I do not cause trouble." "What about references?" he asked. "I worked 2 years for the Langley family in Amarillo," she said. Mrs. Langley died of fever this past July. The family sold the house and scattered east. I have a letter." She produced it from her carpet bag, a single folded page, neat and proper. He read it standing in the yard while she waited without fidgeting. The letter confirmed everything she had said. It called her capable, trustworthy, and quiet. It said she was a good woman who had been dealt an unkind hand by circumstance and deserved a decent situation. Arthur folded the letter and handed it back. "Room and board plus $12 a month," he said. "You cook 3 meals a day and keep the house. Sundays are your own after the noon meal." "Yes, Mr. Barlow," she said. That was how it began, quietly, without drama, like most things that later become enormous. The Barlow Ranch house was a solid structure by the standards of the Texas Panhandle in 1882, 2 stories. Built of limestone blocks that had been hauled 40 miles by ox team 15 years ago when Arthur's father, James Barlow, had first broken this land and decided he intended to stay on it permanently. The ground floor held a kitchen, a parlor, a dining room that doubled as an office, and a storeroom. The upper floor had 3 bedrooms. Arthur took the largest one at the front of the house, overlooking the yard and the long, flat line of the horizon. The smallest room at the back of the house, overlooking the corral and the tack barn, became Delia's. She moved in with very little ceremony and a great deal of efficiency. By the end of her first full day, the kitchen had been reorganized to a system that made sense. The parlor windows had been washed, and supper salt pork, beans, cornbread, and a dried apple pie that nearly made Sela's Prout weep had been served hot and on time. Arthur ate it in the dining room alone, as was his habit, and he thought the pie was the best thing he had tasted in 3 years. He did not say so. He was not a man who said such things easily. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded exactly as stated. The meals were hot and well made. The house was clean. Delia was present, efficient and careful in that quiet way of hers, and if she spoke rarely and volunteered nothing about herself, Arthur took no particular notice of it. He was not a conversationalist himself. He spent his days on horseback or in the yard and came in for meals, ate, and went back out or to bed. It was a simple arrangement and it suited him. It was Sela's who first said something was peculiar. He came to Arthur on a Tuesday evening after supper, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands in that way he had when he was working up to something he thought might not land well. "Notice something," Sela said. "Then say it," Arthur said. "Miss Holloway." "She doesn't eat supper with the house lit." Arthur looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sela said slowly, "that I came up to the house last evening around 8 o'clock to ask you about the fence line on the north pasture, and the house was dark as a pit, every lamp out, not even a candle. I thought nobody was home, but when I knocked she answered the door." Arthur said nothing. "She said she was sorry she'd forgotten to light them," Sela said. "But the thing is, boss, it was 8 o'clock. The kitchen had been cleaned and the supper plate was set out cold on the table. She hadn't eaten it." Arthur went back to the house and looked at the supper plate that night with new eyes. He hadn't thought much about it. He assumed she ate before or after he did in the kitchen, as was natural, but the plate was cold, and now that he thought about it, it had been cold for several days running. And the house had been dark when he came in last night, and he'd assumed she'd gone to bed early. He'd lit the parlor lamp himself. He went to the bottom of the stairs and called up to her. "Miss Holloway, a moment, please." She appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown with a shawl around her shoulders, a candle in her hand, and she looked perfectly composed in the way of someone who was very practiced at looking composed. "Is something the matter, Mr. Barlow?" "Are you eating supper?" he asked. A pause very brief, almost undetectable. "I eat when I'm hungry, sir." "That is not what I asked." "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good night, Mr. Barlow." And she withdrew, and he stood at the bottom of the stairs listening to her door close softly, and he thought about that small pause, that fraction of a second where something flickered across her face before the composure shut back down like a shutter, and he did not sleep easily that night. The next day he watched her more carefully, and he was not subtle about it, and she noticed, and she became more careful herself, And for a week they circled each other in this way, him watching, her composed, the supper cold every night, the house dark by 7 in the evening, and Arthur growing more unsettled by the day. It was not the cold suppers that unsettled him, if he was honest. It was the darkness. Because he had begun to notice a pattern. She lit the lamps in the mornings and kept them burning all day and through the afternoon. But as the sun went down and the evening came on, the lamps went out one by one, and by the time true dark fell, the house was black. And she was inside it, not asleep, not resting, just present in the dark, alone. He found her on the corral fence for the first time on the third night of paying attention. She was sitting up there in the moonlight, still and quiet, and the house behind her was completely dark, and he understood suddenly that she was not outside because she preferred it. She was outside because outside, even at night, was not truly dark. There was the moon, there were the stars. There was always some ambient light over the flat open land of the Texas Panhandle, and the darkness here was a different kind than whatever she was trying to avoid inside. He went back inside and lit every lamp in the house. When she came in an hour later and found them all burning, she stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Her hand went to the frame. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper he was pretending to read, and he looked up at her over it. "Sit down, Miss Holloway," he said, "and eat your supper before it gets cold." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down, pulled the plate toward her and began to eat, and neither of them said anything, and the lamps burned warm and yellow all around the kitchen walls, and he watched her eat, and something in his chest shifted slightly, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just quietly, like a bone settling back into a socket it had been out of for a very long time. She finished the last bite and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. And then, "How long have you known?" "I have not known anything," he said carefully. "I have suspected something for 10 days. I do not know what." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the panhandle grass, that low, endless Texas sound, and the coyotes somewhere to the north called to each other in the dark. "There was a fire," she said. He set down his coffee cup. "I was 11 years old," she said. "We were living in a boarding house in Abilene. My father worked the cattle drives. My mother took in laundry. There were 7 families in the building." She paused. "It started at midnight. Something in the walls, the wiring was old, or maybe a candle someone left burning. Nobody ever knew for certain. I woke up to the sound, and everything was black with smoke, and I could not see anything, and I could not find my mother." She stopped again. Her hands in her lap were very still. "I was in the dark for a long time before someone pulled me out through a window." Arthur said nothing. He understood that the right thing here was silence. "My mother got out," Delia said. "She was burned on her hands and arms. She recovered mostly. My father came back from the drive in November, and we moved to Wichita and then to Amarillo." She looked down at her hands. "But I have not been able to be in a dark room since then. Not truly dark, not without light somewhere." She looked up at him, and he saw in her eyes for the first time the thing she had been carrying around behind all that careful composure. "I know it is foolish. I am 24 years old, and I know perfectly well that darkness cannot harm me. It is not rational." "Fear is rarely rational," Arthur said. His voice was quiet and level, and he kept his eyes on hers so she would understand he was not dismissing her. "That does not mean it is not real." Something changed in her face. Something that had been braced against him very subtly, without her perhaps even being aware of it, slowly let go. "I was afraid," she said, "that if I told you, you would think me weak, or foolish, or unsuitable." "You have kept this house and cooked every meal without complaint for 6 weeks," he said. "Nothing about that is unsuitable." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I went without eating every night because I could not make myself light the lamps after dark. It seemed extravagant, the oil, the expense." "Miss Holloway," he said, "light every lamp in this house every single night. I will buy the oil from now until the last day one of us is standing in this building. Do you understand me?" She blinked. It was the first time he had seen her expression crack into something genuinely unguarded, and what was underneath was not weakness at all. It was a kind of profound and cautious relief. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Barlow." He nodded and stood up and took his coffee to the parlor and sat in the dark, which did not bother him at all, he being a man who had slept on open ground under open sky for most of his adult life. And he thought about a girl of 11 in a burning building, unable to see, unable to find her mother, and something hot and protective moved through him that he had absolutely no business feeling about his housekeeper, and he filed it away and did not examine it. But it did not leave. The next 3 weeks changed things between them, not dramatically, not in any way that either of them could have pointed to on a particular day and said there. That was when it changed. It was more like the shifting of a season, gradual, total, and entirely without permission. Arthur began leaving a lamp burning in the kitchen before he went to bed, whether he was the last one up or not. Delia noticed this without comment, but she began eating supper at the table with the lamps burning, and the food was always hot now, and she ate with the particular quiet pleasure of someone for whom warmth and light had become newly and acutely precious. He found himself staying in the kitchen longer in the evenings than he had any reason to. He told himself it was the coffee, which was better than anything he had brewed himself in years. He told himself it was the warmth of the stove, which was true and not the whole truth. Delia, for her part, began to talk a little more carefully at first, testing the territory, and then more freely when she found that he listened without judgment and responded without mockery. She had opinions. This surprised him, though he could not have said why it should. She was clearly an intelligent woman, and intelligent women generally had opinions. She had views on cattle management that were oddly practical for someone who had never worked a ranch, derived from years of listening to her father talk about the drives. She had read more books than anyone Arthur knew personally, including the schoolmaster in the nearest town of Calder Creek, 15 miles east. She liked mathematics, which he found genuinely startling, and she could do sums in her head faster than he could do them on paper. He began asking her to look over the ranch accounts. This was either a natural evolution or a deliberate excuse to spend more time in the same room with her, and he was honest enough with himself by early November to admit it was probably both. Silas Prout noticed. Silas noticed everything, which was what made him an excellent foreman and an occasionally irritating human being. He said nothing for 2 weeks, and then one morning when Arthur was saddling his horse and Silas was leaning against the fence watching with the specific expression of a man who is saving something up, he finally said it. "You like her." Arthur kept his eyes on the cinch. "She is a competent employee." "You like her," Silas said again, as if Arthur had not spoken. Arthur swung up into the saddle. "Mind the north fence line today. 2 posts need resetting." "You like her and you don't know what to do about it," Silas said to Arthur's back as he rode out of the yard. "Because you are the most stubborn man in the state of Texas, and you would rather break before you bend, which is a terrible quality in a man, and I have told you so for 15 years. Arthur did not reply because Silas was right and the distance between them was growing, and that was convenient. He rode the range for 4 hours, checking cattle, checking fence, doing the work his body knew how to do without being told, and he thought about Delia Holloway in a way he had been trying very hard not to think about her. Not strategically or practically, or with the part of his brain that made decisions about land and livestock, but with the part that had been very quiet for a very long time, the part that registered warmth and humor, and the specific quality of a person's eyes when they were paying attention to something that interested them. She had dark eyes that went very bright when she was engaged with a problem. She had a way of pressing her lips together when she was thinking, not frowning but concentrating, and it was a gesture he looked forward to seeing in a way that had become completely unreasonable. She laughed rarely and quietly, but when she did it was genuine and unguarded, and the first time he had made her laugh actually made her laugh, by telling a story about a steer that had somehow gotten into the ranch house kitchen 2 summers ago and eaten an entire bushel of cornmeal. He had felt a satisfaction that he could not quite account for through any practical means. He knew her fear now. He knew about the fire. And he had made it a quiet project, not obvious, not overbearing, just consistent, to make sure the house was never dark when she was in it. He bought 4 additional lamps and placed them throughout the house and kept the oil stores full. He started banking the kitchen fire higher in the evening so it would burn longer. He did not announce any of this. He simply did it, and she knew he was doing it, and neither of them spoke of it, and somehow that unspoken understanding had become the most intimate thing in his daily life, which told him quite clearly that he was in serious trouble. The question was what to do about it. He was a practical man. He believed in the direct approach when the direct approach was possible. The trouble was that the direct approach here required honesty about feelings that he had not examined in years. Not since Sarah Cabot, the schoolmaster's daughter from Calder Creek, who had promised to wait for him when he went north with the cattle in the summer of 1878, and had married the bank manager's son by October. He had told himself then that he was not built for that kind of thing, and he had believed it for 4 years. And now Delia Holloway was sitting in his kitchen doing his accounts by lamplight with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, because she always took the pins out in the evenings, and he was not sure he had ever believed it at all. He came home in the early afternoon, which he almost never did, and found her in the parlor with a book. She looked up when he came in, something that might have been pleasure crossing her face before the composure reinstated itself, and she said good afternoon and asked if he wanted coffee. "I want to talk to you," he said. She set the book down carefully. He pulled up the straight-back chair across from the settle where she was sitting and sat in it and put his hat on his knee and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was either a second or a year. "I know this is not a simple thing to say," he began. "Mr. Barlow." "Arthur," he said. "Please," she blinked. Something moved in her expression, not retreat, not alarm, but a careful, wondering attention. "Arthur," she said, as if trying the word. It fit somehow. It sounded right. "I am a man who does not generally say things he does not mean," he said, "and I do not have a gift for being eloquent, so I will say what I mean plainly and you can tell me what you think of it." She nodded very slightly. Her hands were folded in her lap. He had come to understand that this was not a passive gesture. It was the physical form of her attention, the way she gathered herself to receive something. "I think highly of you," he said, "not as an employee, as a person, as a woman, and I think I have been pretending otherwise to myself for several weeks now, and I am not willing to keep pretending." He paused. "I am not asking anything of you. I am not putting you in a difficult position with regard to your work here. I want to be very clear about that. But I am not a man who finds it easy to keep this kind of thing inside and say nothing indefinitely, so I am saying it." Delia looked at him for a very long time. He did not look away. He was afraid to look away, actually, because he needed to see her face when she answered, needed to know immediately so he could make adjustments, build whatever distance was necessary if he had misread everything, but also because he was just afraid, in the plain and basic way that a person is afraid when they have handed someone something irreplaceable and are waiting to find out if they are going to be careful with it. "I was not going to say anything," she said finally. "I thought I had misread it. I thought it was gratitude maybe for the lamps, or just proximity, people living in the same house, eating at the same table. I thought I was inventing it." "You were not inventing it," he said. "No," she said. "I can see that now." He waited. "I am afraid," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from when she had said it about the darkness. This was a different kind of fear, older and more deliberate, the kind that has been built up over time rather than created in a single terrible night. Not of the dark, of this, of being in a situation where I depend on someone else and then that situation disappears. I have had that happen before." She paused. "Not a marriage, just employment, places I thought were permanent." And then they were not, through no fault of my own, and I was alone again in a city where I knew no one, with very little money and a great deal of recalibrating to do. I understand, he said. I do not think you do quite, she said gently. A man alone in this world has options. A woman alone in this world has considerably fewer. And a woman alone who has also become attached to the place she has lost has the hardest time of all. He sat with that for a moment. He thought she was right, and thinking she was right made him want to say something that would address it, and he knew the only thing he could say that would actually address it was also the largest and most irrevocable thing he had ever contemplated saying to any human being. Then I will not be something that disappears, he said. She looked at him. I mean that, he said. I am not a man who makes promises he does not intend to keep. And I am not making a promise now because it is early and I know it is early, and I am not going to rush you towards something you have not decided. But I am saying, the option I am putting in front of you is not temporary. It is not circumstantial. I am not going anywhere. This ranch is not going anywhere. And if you decided at some point that you wanted to stay here not as my housekeeper but as if you wanted to stay differently, that would be permanent. He was not eloquent. He had told her that at the outset, but she understood him, and her face, for the first time since he had known her, was completely unguarded. No composure, no careful management. Just Delia, looking at him with those dark, bright eyes full of something he recognized, because he had felt it himself for weeks without being able to name it. You are a very unusual man, Arthur Barlow, she said. I have been told I am difficult, he said. Difficult and unusual are not the same thing, she said. Difficult means you are hard to deal with. Unusual means you are different from what I expected. She paused. You are not hard to deal with at all. You are direct, and you are kind without making it seem like a performance. The lamps were not subtle, he said. No, she said, and she smiled, really smiled, the unguarded version, and it did something to him that was entirely beyond his capacity to be stoic about. They were not subtle. They were the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. They did not reach any formal conclusion that afternoon. But something had been named, and once named it could not be unnamed, and the thing that had been quietly building between them was now openly acknowledged, and the house felt different that evening, warmer, somehow, more like something that belonged to both of them rather than a place where one person employed another. Delia cooked supper that night, and it was extraordinary. She made a beef and vegetable stew with dried herbs from the garden she had quietly started in the kitchen window, and fresh biscuits, and a vinegar pie that was sharper and better than anything Arthur had tasted since his mother's kitchen. She ate at the table with the lamps burning, and he ate across from her, and they talked through the whole meal about the ranch accounts, about the cattle market prices he had read about in the week-old newspaper that came by stage from Amarillo, about a book she had been reading, about his father who had broken this land and the stories attached to it. He told her about his father James, who had been a difficult man himself, not unkind but iron-willed, a man who had dragged limestone 40 miles by ox team because he had decided this land would hold a real house, and he was not going to be argued out of it. He told her about his mother, Margaret, who had been the warmth in the house, the person who had made it feel inhabitable, who had baked and read aloud and kept flowers in a tin on the windowsill every summer until she died of pneumonia 3 winters ago. He had not talked about his mother to anyone since Sela's. Delia listened the way she always did, completely, without performing interest, actually there. And then she told him about her father, who had walked the cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for 15 years, and who had smelled of trail dust and wood smoke every time he came home, and who had told stories at the supper table that made the room feel larger than it was. She had adored him. He had died of a fever contracted on the drive in the fall of 1876 when she was 17, and she had not talked about him either, she said, for a very long time. After supper he washed the dishes and she dried them, and this small domestic act, standing beside each other at the kitchen wash basin in the lamplight, felt more intimate than anything that had happened in the parlor that afternoon. And when her hand brushed his passing him the last cup to rinse, neither of them moved away from the contact, and they stood for a moment closer than they had ever been. And it was November on the Texas Panhandle, and the wind was coming off the plains outside. And inside the kitchen was warm and lit, and something in Arthur Barlow that had been very tightly closed for 4 years opened quietly and let the warmth in. He did not kiss her that night. He thought about it, standing by the kitchen door as she lit her candle to go upstairs. But he did not, because he was committed to not rushing anything, and also because he was the kind of man who needed to think things through carefully before he acted on them, and he had not finished thinking yet. He said good night, and she said good night, and she went upstairs, and he stood in the kitchen in the lamplight feeling something he could not fully articulate, not quite happiness, because happiness felt like too light a word for what this was. Something more like the recognition of a direction, a true north. A thing the compass had been pointing toward for years that he had kept not looking at, and now he had looked, and there it was. The following weeks brought a kind of happiness that neither of them had much experience with, and both of them treated with something between astonishment and great care. They fell into new habits. She began saving him a cup of coffee in the mornings before he went out, leaving it on the stove where it would stay warm. He began coming in for the midday meal, which he had never done before, rather than eating in the field. They walked to the corral together in the evenings before supper, her wrapped in her shawl, him in his coat, the November sky going every shade of amber and rose and violet over the flat horizon, and talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. Silas watched all of this with the expression of a man who has been correct for some time and is finding it deeply satisfying. He came to Arthur one cold morning in late November and said, without preamble, "You going to make it proper?" Arthur looked up from the fence post he was checking. "That is not your business, Silas. She's living under your roof and Silas gestured, encompassing 2 months of lamplight and evening walks in the particular way Arthur's face looked when he watched Delia cross the yard. "She's a respectable woman, you know what people say. There is nobody for 15 miles in any direction to say anything," Arthur said. "There is Calder Creek," Silas said, "and the supply wagon comes through, and people talk in this country." Arthur straightened up and looked across the yard at the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see the lamp burning and Delia's silhouette as she moved around the kitchen. He felt the same thing he always felt when he looked at that, a pull, steady and deep, like the pull of water over stone. "I know," he said. He thought about it for another week. He was not a man who acted without being sure. But he was also beginning to understand that there was no amount of additional thinking that was going to make this clearer than it already was, and that he was using thinking as a substitute for courage, which was a thing he generally had plenty of, and seemed to have temporarily misplaced. He found it again on a Thursday evening in early December. He had ridden into Calder Creek that day on business, a meeting with the land agent about a parcel of adjacent property he was considering purchasing, and a conversation with the general store about spring supply orders. While he was there, he stopped in at the small jeweler's shop that occupied the back corner of the dry goods store, kept by a man named Esterhaus who had come west from Cincinnati 15 years ago and still wore a vest and gold watch chain every single day as if he had never quite accepted that he was in Texas. Esterhaus showed him 3 rings. Arthur looked at all 3 and chose immediately, without hesitation, which suggested that he had already known what he wanted long before he walked through the door. He rode home in the early evening, the ring in his coat pocket wrapped in a piece of brown paper, and the sky was enormous and orange above the flat land, and he felt the specific calm that comes when you have stopped fighting yourself and made a decision. Delia was in the kitchen when he came in, as she always was at this hour. She had made a chicken roasted with dried herbs, and the house smelled like food and warmth and the wood smoke from the parlor fire she must have lit earlier. She looked up when he came through the door, her cheeks flushed from the stove, her dark hair beginning to escape its pins in the warmth, and she said, "You are back later than I expected. I was beginning to worry." And the fact that she had been worried, that she noticed and registered his absence and felt something about it, went straight to his chest. "I had extra business in town," he said. He took off his coat and hat and hung them on the hook by the door and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the kitchen table rather than going to the dining room, because they had fallen out of the habit of him eating alone in the dining room about 3 weeks ago. She set his plate in front of him and poured coffee and then sat down with her own plate across from him, and the lamps burned warm on all 4 walls. He waited until they had both eaten. He thought it was better that she not be hungry when he said this. When her plate was clean and she was cradling her coffee in both hands and looking out the window at the dark prairie beyond, he put his hand in his coat pocket and brought out the paper-wrapped ring and set it on the table between them. She looked at it. Then at him. "Open it," he said. She set her coffee down and picked up the paper and unfolded it, and the ring lay in her palm, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, deep red, chosen because something about its color made him think of the warmth of lamplight, which was not something he was ever going to say aloud but which was absolutely true. She looked at it for a long time. Her expression was the unguarded one, no composure, nothing managed, just Delia. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because it is proper, though it is. Not because of the house or the ranch or any practical consideration. Because you are the person I want to sit across from at this table for the rest of my life, and I have known it for some time, and I am asking you now." She looked up from the ring. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. "I left Cincinnati," he continued. "I mean, I have not always been sure what I was building here. My father built the house and the land, and I have kept it and added to it, but sometimes I was not certain it was for anything beyond the work itself." He paused. "It is for something now, if you say yes." She was quiet for a moment that was not a reluctant moment. He could read her well enough by now to know the difference between hesitation from doubt and hesitation from being overwhelmed. This was the second kind. "Yes," she said. "Arthur, yes." He took the ring from her palm and slid it onto her finger, and it fit exactly right, and she laughed that real, unguarded laugh and said, "How did you know the size?" And he said, "I guessed." And she said, "You guessed correctly." And he said, "I am good at most things when I pay attention." And she shook her head, and he leaned across the table and kissed her for the first time, right there in the kitchen with the supper dishes not yet cleared and the lamps burning all around them and the wind coming off the Texas plain outside. And it was straightforward and honest and warm, and it was the best decision he had ever made. They were married in Calder Creek on the 15th of December, 1882, at the small Methodist church that served the scattered ranching community of the surrounding county. It was a simple ceremony. Silas Prout stood up for Arthur, and the minister's wife stood up for Delia. And there were perhaps 12 people in the pews, including 3 of Arthur's ranch hands who had ridden in for the occasion, and who cleaned up considerably better than he would have predicted. Delia wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself from fabric purchased at the dry goods store, and she had flowers from the dried autumn wildflowers she had kept in a jar in her room. The kind that hold their color when dried, goldenrod and little purple things, whose name Arthur did not know. And she looked more beautiful to him than anything he had words for, which was appropriate since he had already used most of his available eloquence, and was not sure he had more in reserve. When the minister asked if he took this woman to be his lawful wedded wife, he said yes with the same directness he brought to everything, and he meant it with every part of him. When the minister asked Delia if she took this man, she looked at Arthur when she said yes, not at the minister, and what he saw in her face when she said it was the final piece of the careful management dissolving, not the composure that protected her from the outside world, but the deeper inner bracing, the part that had kept itself apart because it had expected to be alone, expected situations to end, expected to be recalibrating. All of that let go in one quiet yes. and he held her hand a little tighter through the end of the ceremony. They drove home to the ranch in the late afternoon, the winter sky going colors that had no names and the flat land spreading in every direction, enormous and empty and theirs. Sila's had the ranch hands build a bonfire in the yard for the celebration, and there was whiskey for the men and coffee, and cake that the minister's wife had contributed, and Arthur danced with Delia badly, because he was not a dancing man and made no pretense of it, while one of the hands played a fiddle by the firelight, and she laughed at his footwork and then very gracefully took the lead so that he would not step on her any more, and he let her. And the firelight moved in her eyes, and she was his wife, and he thought he might be the luckiest man in Texas, which was a thought so far outside his normal operating range that he examined it briefly to make sure it was real, and then let it stand. The hands eventually dispersed, and Silas went to his bunkhouse bunk with a satisfied expression, and Arthur and Delia went inside, and every lamp in the house was burning, which was as it should be. Winter settled over the ranch with the particular weight of a Texas panhandle winter, not brutal like the northern territories but cold and dry, and filled with wind that came off the plains without any obstruction for 100 miles, and made the limestone walls of the house creak. The ranch work did not stop because of cold or marriage. The cattle had to be checked, and the fences had to be kept, and the horses had to be shod, and the daily mechanics of 5,000 acres did not pause for sentiment. But the house was different. Everything about it was different. Delia rearranged the parlor, which had been arranged by no one in particular for the past 3 years, and showed it, and put a rug in front of the fireplace that she had ordered from a catalog out of Kansas City, dark red and cream, and it transformed the room from a place where Arthur sometimes sat to a room where a person might actually want to spend time. She grew things in the kitchen windows, herbs, and whatever she could manage indoors through winter, and the house began to smell like growing things even in January. She continued the accounts, which she had now fully taken over from Arthur with his complete relief and approval, and she organized the supply ordering, and she added a small vegetable garden to the back of the house on the sheltered south-facing wall, and she managed all of this with the same quiet efficiency she had always had, except that now there was no composure covering it. The efficiency was just hers, uncovered, and she moved through the house and yard with a quality that had not been there before, a settledness, a belonging. Arthur noticed it with a quiet wonder that never quite went away. He was not a demonstrative man in the way of some men. He did not make speeches or grand gestures, did not write poetry or arrive with armloads of wildflowers. His love expressed itself in the shape of daily life, in the lamp oil he bought in double quantities, in the catalog order from Kansas City that included an additional item she had pointed to once and not asked for, in the way he always came to the kitchen door before going out in the mornings to say goodbye, which he had never done before in his life, and which he now did without thinking. In the way he told her things about the ranch that he had never told anyone because they had never mattered enough to anyone to be worth saying, and she gave back in kind, not with demonstrations but with presents, with coffee on the stove and the accounts done and the house warm, with her voice in the evenings, reading aloud from whatever book she was working through, in the parlor with the fire and all the lamps, with her hand in his when they sat together, a simple and habitual contact that he had not known he needed until it was there. They had their first disagreement in February about the purchase of the adjacent land parcel. She had looked at the accounts, and she had concerns about the debt load at current cattle prices, and she brought them to him with numbers and a clear argument, and he had his own reasons for the purchase that were partly practical and partly about his father's original vision for the ranch, and he gave his argument back. And they sat across the dining room table with the lamp between them and the account books open, and they argued about it for an hour and a half. Both of them direct and thorough, and neither of them cruel. And at the end of it he agreed with 2 of her 3 main points and modified his plan accordingly, and she agreed that the long-term case for the purchase was sound, and they reached a conclusion that was better than either of them had started with. After she said, "Your father would have just decided and not discussed it with anyone." "Yes," he said. "I prefer this way," she said. "So do I," he said, and he meant it. He had not known until he had it that this was what he wanted, not someone who deferred to him because it was expected, but someone who pushed back with intelligence and honesty and could be pushed back against in return. It made every decision better and every day more alive. Spring came to the Panhandle in the slow and tentative way of a place that does not fully trust warmth yet. The prairie grass went green and then greener, and the cattle moved to the new pasture, and Delia's outdoor garden went in with a thoroughness that astonished the ranch hands. She had planned it over the winter with the same care she brought to the accounts, and by May there were neat rows of vegetables covering a substantial plot on the south side of the house. And she had also ordered fruit tree saplings from a nursery in San Antonio that arrived by stage in April, and which she and Arthur planted together on a Saturday morning, him digging and her directing the placement with a level and a string line. Silas leaned on the fence and watched and said nothing, which for Silas was the equivalent of a lengthy compliment. In late March, Delia told Arthur quietly over breakfast that she thought she was going to have a child. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. She was watching him with that particular attention she had, measuring, waiting, ready for whatever came. What came was something he had not planned and could not have predicted. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with a sigh that was months of careful self-sufficiency releasing all at once, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the window and the spring birds beginning somewhere outside. "All right," he said, which was not eloquent. But she understood what he meant by it, which was all right is the most accurate word I have for this amount of rightness, and she laughed and said, "All right," back, and that was their celebration. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer of 1883 was hot in the particular grinding way of Texas summers, and Delia was tired in a way she refused to acknowledge until Arthur began quietly reorganizing the workload of the house, so that the heaviest tasks were handled by the ranch hands, the water hauling, the wood splitting. And she found that somehow everything still got done without her doing all of it, and she did not argue, which told him she was more tired than she was saying. She was afraid, too, though she did not say this directly. He knew it not because she showed it, but because he knew how to read the things she did not show. She went quiet sometimes in the evenings in a way that was different from her reading quiet or her thinking quiet, and he sat with her through it without pressing, and sometimes she said what it was and sometimes she did not, and either way was acceptable to him. What she said when she did say it was that she had seen hard things happen to women in childbed, that her aunt had lost a baby and nearly lost herself, that she was not afraid of the pain but of the other kind of loss, the kind you could not see coming and could not prevent by being careful or competent or brave. He told her that they had sent for the best doctor available from Amarillo, who would come when her time was near. He told her that he would be there. He told her, and this was the thing she held on to, that whatever happened, she would not be alone in any of it, and she would not be left to manage any of it by herself. She believed him, which was itself a kind of courage. Their son was born on the 2nd of September, 1883, with the end of summer heat still pressing down on the Panhandle, and a doctor named Everett Bishop in attendance. A solid, practical man from Amarillo who had delivered a great many babies and had the steady hands and calm voice that the situation required. It was long and hard, and Arthur was in the house for all of it, which was not the usual arrangement. Men generally waited outside. But Delia had said she wanted him near and he was not going anywhere, and Dr. Bishop had shrugged and said he had seen stranger things, and Silas Prout sat on the porch with a pipe and a bottle of whiskey he was not really drinking and waited. When it was over and the baby was announced and Delia was exhausted and alive and present, and holding the child with that look on her face, not composure, not careful management, just pure unguarded wonder, Arthur sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for the first time, and the feeling that went through him had no analogue in any previous experience of his life. "James," he said, after his father. "James," she agreed. Then, "James Arthur Barlow." He looked at her. "You do not have to, I want to," she said. "Both of them." James Arthur Barlow weighed 8 pounds and 4 ounces, and had dark eyes that would lighten to hazel as he grew, and lungs that he demonstrated immediately and thoroughly. Arthur held him while Delia slept, the baby wrapped in the wool blanket she had knitted over the course of the summer, blue and white, the first thing she had ever knitted and somewhat uneven in places, which made it better. And he sat by the window in the bedroom with the lamp burning, and the panhandle night outside and his son in his arms, and the magnitude of what had happened here on this land, and in this house settled over him with a weight that was not heavy but permanent. He had not known, building this life, that he was building it for all of this. He had known it abstractly. Land was for legacy. Work was for something larger than the workday. But he had not felt it in his body until right now, with this small and enormous person in his arms and Delia sleeping behind him and the lamp burning steady against the dark. In the morning Delia woke and ate everything he brought her and nursed the baby and looked at Arthur across the room with those bright dark eyes and said, "We made something rather extraordinary." "We did," he said. "I did rather more of the work," she said. "You did," he agreed. "Considerably more," she smiled. "But you stayed." "I will always stay," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the morning light, James sleeping against her shoulder, the lamp still burning, though it was no longer necessary now that the day had come. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you will. That is not something I am afraid of any more." He understood what she meant, not afraid of his absence, not bracing against the disappearance of something good, not standing ready to recalibrate, just present and trusting and belonging. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead and took the baby so she could sleep again, and he carried James to the window and showed him the panhandle morning, the long flat land going gold and green all the way to the horizon, the cattle moving in the far pasture, Sila's Prout crossing the yard below with his particular long-legged walk, the fruit trees they had planted in April standing small and brave along the south fence. James blinked at all of it without comprehension, which was appropriate for a person who had been in the world for approximately 8 hours. Arthur told him about it anyway. The land. His grandfather James, who had hauled limestone 40 miles by ox team because he decided this place was worth a real house. His grandmother Margaret, who had kept flowers in a tin on the windowsill every summer. The 5,000 acres that were his by inheritance and work and love. And the woman sleeping in the room behind them, who had come on a September stage with a carpet bag and a letter and dark eyes full of careful composure, and who had left her supper cold every night for 6 weeks until he had finally understood what she needed and why, and who, once the lamp was lit and the fear had a name, had become the thing that made all of it mean something. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years on a working ranch in the Texas Panhandle ever were. There were bad winters and there were bad cattle prices, and there was a drought in the summer of 1886 that turned the grass brown and tested the ranch's resources in ways that required every scrap of calculation both Arthur and Delia could bring to bear. They pulled through it with the land reduced slightly, one pasture sold at a loss, and the accounts painful but not catastrophic, and they did it together at the dining room table with the lamp between them and the account books open, and neither of them sparing the other from the reality of it. They had a second child, a boy again, born in 1885, whom they named William, for Delia's father whose middle name it had been, since her father's given name of Sila's was already taken in their household by someone who did not need a namesake to know he was valued. William Holloway Barlow was a different child from James entirely. Where James was quiet and watchful like his mother, William was loud and interested in everything, and had his father's directness in a form that occasionally made Arthur want to laugh, and occasionally made him want to send the child to live somewhere else temporarily. He never did either of these things in William's presence. A third child came in 1888, a girl, finally, whom Delia named Clara after her mother, and who had Arthur's coloring and Delia's watchful eyes, and who was, from the beginning, both the most stubborn and most tender-hearted person in a household that was already well supplied with both qualities. They raised them in the house with the lamps always burning. This was simply the way of the Barlow household. No one ever remarked on it as unusual, because it had always been so. There were lamps in every room, and they were kept filled and lit. The children grew up knowing where to find a match and how to trim a wick, and none of them were ever afraid of the dark, not particularly, though none of them knew exactly why their mother kept the lights burning so carefully, or what she had seen as a girl of 11 in a burning building in Abilene. She told them eventually, Clara first, when Clara was 12 and asked why there were always so many lamps. She told the story quietly and simply, without drama, not making it larger than it was and not making it smaller than it was. She told it the way she had told it to Arthur 10 years earlier, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight. Clara listened the way Delia listened, completely without performing actually there. And the man who helped you understand it was not foolish, Clara said. Was that father? Yes, Delia said. How did he help? Clara asked. He lit the lamps, Delia said simply. Clara thought about this for a moment. Then she said that was very smart of him. It was, Delia said. He is a smart man, and a kind one. Clara went and found her father in the yard and informed him of this assessment, which Arthur received without expression, which Clara had learned meant he was pleased, but was not going to demonstrate it where anyone could see him clearly. Arthur Barlow at 50 was not a greatly changed man from Arthur Barlow at 30, somewhat more weathered, somewhat more settled in himself, the iron that had always been there perhaps softer at the edges but no less present. He still rose before dawn and worked long days and spoke plainly, and listened when listening was the right thing to do. He had added 2,000 acres to the ranch since his father's original grant, and the herd was the largest and most respected in that part of the Panhandle, and he was known in Calder Creek and Amarillo as a man of absolute reliability. His word was his contract, his handshake was his bond, and he came home every evening to a house full of light. Delia at 48 was more openly herself than she had been at 24, not noisier, not less careful, but less braced against the world. The composure was still there, because it was part of her character and always had been, but it was no longer armor. It was simply the way she was organized. The dark eyes were just as watchful and just as bright, and she still folded her hands in her lap when she was paying attention to something, and Arthur still found it, after decades, the most legible and endearing thing he had ever seen a person do. She had grown into the land in a way that he had hoped for and then been grateful for, and had never quite stopped marveling at. She knew every fence line and pasture name. She knew the hands by their families and histories. She had, at some point he could not precisely identify, become part of the thing his father had started here, not by being absorbed into it but by adding her own substance to it, so that the ranch was now neither his father's vision nor his own, but something that belonged to both of them, built from limestone and oil lamp light and account books and apple trees and dried wildflowers, and the smell of coffee, and the sound of her voice reading aloud in the parlor. In the autumn of 1896, the same October month in which Delia had first climbed the corral fence in the moonlight to sit with the light of the stars, 14 years previous, Arthur came home from a long day in the far pasture and found her in the kitchen, and the supper was hot and the lamps were all burning, and James was home from the university in Austin for a visit, and William was arguing with him about something neither of them had the facts quite right about. And Clara was watching them both with an expression that was pure Delia, watchful and amused and waiting for the moment when she would say the one precise thing that would settle the argument without either of them quite realizing she had done it. Arthur stood in the kitchen doorway and took all of this in. Delia looked up from the stove, felt him in the doorway the way she always did. She had always been able to feel when he was near, even from the beginning, which she had thought at first was nervousness and had gradually understood was the opposite. And she saw his expression, and she said nothing, just looked at him. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, right there in front of all three of his children, which prompted William to say a word he was not supposed to say in the house, and James to roll his eyes with considerable theatricality, and Clara to smile at both of her parents in the particular way she had that suggested she understood more than her age should allow. "How was the far pasture?" Delia said when he stepped back. "The north fence needs attention," he said. "The cattle are well. The sky was something extraordinary out there this afternoon." "I know," she said. "I saw it from the garden. I thought of calling you back, but you were already out." "Next time call me," he said. "Next time I will," she said. They ate supper together, all five of them at the table that was becoming crowded in a way it had not been designed for. James was 22 now and had his mother's build and his father's opinions. And William at 18 was already taller than Arthur and considerably louder. And Clara at 8 was small and decisive, and fit between them like a comma between two long sentences, making the whole thing parse correctly. After supper, Arthur helped clear and Delia washed and Clara dried, and the boys argued in the parlor, and the kitchen was full of the sounds of a house fully inhabited. And Arthur thought about 9 nights of cold supper, and a girl on a corral fence in the moonlight, afraid of something she could not tell anyone, carrying it alone in the dark. He thought about the lamp he had lit without saying why, and the way she had looked when she came in and found every lamp burning. "You are thinking something," Delia said, without looking up from the basin. "How do you know?" he said. "You always get very quiet when you are thinking something specific," she said, "rather than your general quiet. It has a different quality. 14 years, he said, and you still notice." "I notice everything about you," she said. "I always have." She handed a plate to Clara. "What are you thinking?" He handed her the last pan. She took it and looked at him, waiting. "I was thinking about the corral fence," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, the real one, the unguarded one, the one that had hit him with the force of something irreversible the first time he had seen it, and had not diminished by a single degree in the years since. "The corral fence," she said. "You were sitting on the top rail in the moonlight," he said, "and the house was dark behind you. And I came out and told you the supper was cold, which was an extremely uncharitable thing to say. You did not know," she said. "I know," he said, "but I was not kind in that moment." "You were kind in every moment after," she said. "That is what matters." He took the pan from her hands and set it on the draining board and held her face in both of his hands, very gently. And she looked up at him with those dark eyes that were the most familiar thing in his world and also still, every single time, capable of stopping him in his tracks with how much there was in them. Not drama, not performance, just the actual enormous interior life of a woman who had been afraid of the dark, and had let him light a lamp for her, and had eventually, carefully, with a courage that humbled him, led him all the way in. "Thank you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "For what specifically?" "For the September you stepped off the stage," he said. "For staying." "For all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Clara, still holding the dish towel, was watching with the particular attention of a child who understands she is witnessing something important even if she does not have all the vocabulary for it yet. Delia turned her head slightly and kissed his palm, a small and deliberate gesture, very like her, everything precise and nothing wasted. "Thank you," she said, "for the lamps." He smiled at that. He did not smile broadly or often, which was why it always meant something when he did. "All the oil in Texas," he said. "I told you." "You told me," she said, "and you meant it. That was the beginning of all of it." She went back to the washing up, and he dried the last of the dishes, and Clara took them to the shelf. And outside the Panhandle night spread wide and dark in every direction for 100 miles. And inside the Barlow house, every lamp was burning parlor and kitchen and dining room, and the upstairs hallway and the 3 bedrooms. And the light fell through the windows onto the yard and the fence and the October grass. And where it fell the darkness gave way, which was as it had always been. And as it would continue to be in this house, for as long as any of them stood in it. Silas Prout had retired from full foreman duties 2 years ago, at 71, which he had done with enormous reluctance, and only after Arthur had pointed out that he had more than earned it, and also that his joints had been telling him so for a decade, and perhaps he should listen to them. He still lived in the bunkhouse. He would not be moved from it, he had said, in terms that made clear the conversation was not open, and he still came to the house for Sunday dinner, which Delia had insisted on and which he had accepted without the pretense of reluctance that he maintained about everything else. He was at the table that Sunday with James and William and Clara and Arthur and Delia, and he ate his meal with the contentment of a man who has lived to see the thing he set in motion come out better than he had a right to expect, which was, if anyone had pressed him on it, the best feeling he had ever had in connection with any plan he had ever put into motion, and he had put into motion a considerable number of plans over 70-odd years. He had gone to Amarillo on a supply run in September of 1882, and he had come back with Delia Holloway seated beside him on the wagon bench, because she was a woman who needed work and his employer was a man who needed more than he knew, and the Lord had done the arithmetic. And here was the answer 14 years later. A table full of people who would not exist, or would not know each other, or would not be whole without that supply run, and that September stage, and that ordinary, extraordinary decision. After dinner, Silas sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun with his pipe, which the cold in his joints had made difficult to properly enjoy for the past 2 winters, and he thought about arithmetic. Arthur sat beside him for a while, not talking, which was their usual mode, 2 men who communicated adequately in silence. Then Silas said, "That oldest boy of yours, James, he is going to be something." "He already is something," Arthur said. "Something even more," Silas said. "He has your stubbornness and her intelligence. That is a dangerous combination in the best possible way." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then, "You went to Amarillo for flour and nails." "And I came back with both," Silas said mildly. "And Delia Holloway." "The Lord did the arithmetic," Silas said again, with the serenity of a man who has been saying this for 14 years and intends to go on saying it indefinitely. Arthur looked out at the yard, at the fence line, at the far pasture where the cattle moved in the golden October afternoon light, at the fruit trees along the south fence, bigger now, real trees, giving real shade and real fruit in season. At the house behind them with the lamps already burning inside because the sun was beginning to fall, and Delia would have lit them an hour ago, methodically, without drama, every room, every lamp, the same as every evening. Not from fear anymore. She had told him this a few years in, that the fear had changed. Not disappeared entirely. The memory of the smoke and the dark was always somewhere in her. She thought it always would be, but it was not a terror now. It was just a history. The lamps were no longer lit to keep something out. They were lit because she liked the light. Because she had come to associate lamplight with warmth and safety, and the specific quality of an evening in her own home with her own people. And the dark beyond the windows was just the ordinary Texas night, which was full of stars and coyote calls and the sound of the wind over the grass, and which could not touch her. She had said this to him on a winter evening, both of them sitting by the parlor fire, James asleep upstairs and the rest of the house quiet and the lamps burning all around them. "I am not afraid anymore," she had said. "Not really. I light the lamps because I love the light now. There is a difference." "There is," he had said. "You made the difference," she said, "by not making me explain myself, by just providing the light and letting me come to it in my own time." He had not known how to answer that without being either too small about it or too large. So he had reached for her hand across the settee and held it, and she had leaned her head against his shoulder, and the fire had burned and the lamps had burned, and outside the winter wind had moved across the panhandle, and they had sat like that until the fire went low. The October evening of 1896 moved toward full dark, and the stars came out over the Texas panhandle in their usual extravagant numbers, and the lamps in the Barlow house burned warm and steady in every window, visible from the road, visible from the pasture, visible from the old corral fence where a woman had sat 14 years ago in the moonlight eating nothing, afraid to go inside, carrying something she could not say aloud. Inside, the family moved through the evening. James and William's argument had resolved itself into a game of checkers, which William was losing with competitive unhappiness. Clara had gotten a book from the parlor shelf and was reading it with her feet tucked under her on the settee, occasionally looking up to inform William that he was making the wrong move, which was both helpful and unwelcome. Arthur came in from the porch and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at all of it. Delia came in from the storeroom with a jar of preserved peaches she had been looking for, set them on the counter, and turned and saw him standing there. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She looked at him with those eyes. Then she came to him and stood beside him in the doorway, both of them looking into the parlor at the checkerboard and the argument and Clara with her book, and she slipped her hand into his, and they stood like that for a moment in the kitchen doorway with the lamps burning all through the house. "Supper is hot," she said. "I know," he said. "It has been hot every night for 14 years, she said, with a small note of satisfaction that was entirely earned. "Every single night," he agreed. She leaned against him, just slightly, the comfortable lean of two people who have been beside each other long enough that the physical space between them has its own grammar. He put his arm around her shoulders. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and dark and full of stars, and the wind moved through the grass, and the coyotes called from somewhere far to the north, and inside the house on the edge of 5,000 acres on the Texas panhandle, in the autumn of 1896, in the warm lamplight of a home that had been built from limestone and stubbornness and unexpected love, and the simple human kindness of a lamp lit without explanation, Delia Holloway Barlow was not afraid of anything. And Arthur Barlow, who had not known what he was building until she told him, stood beside her and held her hand and knew exactly what he had. The lamp on the kitchen windowsill burned through the night. It would burn there tomorrow, and the night after, and all the nights after that, as long as the house stood and the oil held and someone remembered to trim the wick, which they always would in this household, where light was not taken for granted and never had been and never would be. It was not the grand things in the end. It was not the 5,000 acres or the cattle or the limestone house or the accounts settled and the debts paid. It was the lamp in the window, the supper hot on the table, the hand that reached across the dark. That was the whole of it. That was everything.